Ed Rosenthal is a longtime cannabis author of the Cannabis Growers Encyclopedia. He is a longtime cannabis advocate, especially for home grow. We are very excited to have him on today. Thank you for stopping by again, too, and welcome to the Bluegrass Podcast.
She said, now I'm a red-headed galactic installation corridor revolving around the sun. I know I'm here and that it means love everyone.
You want to go ahead and get started? Thank you for coming on, by the way. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I'd also like to say thank you for your advocacy and education work. I admire it a lot.
Oh, thank you so much.
How do you feel about advocacy at the moment? Do you feel like it's moved away from home grow at all or gotten stronger?
Well, certainly commercial enterprises, as usual, have their lobbies to further the goals of the profit-making corporations, but I think that there's still a lot of activism around legalization, especially for home use and getting prisoners freed.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody should be in prison for marijuana, period.
No, absolutely not. It's a big part of getting the legislation through, right, and making it easy for people.
That's right. And I think that even though there's all this commercialism behind marijuana right now, I think that it's really important that people have the right to grow their own and to process their own.
Absolutely. Working at a dispensary, that was one thing that we told every single patient was go ahead and grow your own too. It'll let you buy higher quality stuff too when you do come in. It'll raise the bar.
That's right. But, it's a plant. Everybody should be allowed to grow it.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts about like plant limits? Because oftentimes they're quite low what the states allow.
I think that plant limits, the entire concept of plant limits is actually hasn't been tried yet, but I don't think that it would withstand court examination based for this reason. It has no basis in science. And the reason why plant limits don't have a basis in science is that a plant can be flowered at any size. So so if they're trying to limit the amount that a person can grow, a plant limit doesn't do it, because you could have 10 plants that don't equal an ounce, and on the other hand, you could have one plant that equals 10 pounds. So there's no science behind a plant count. A good science would be either limiting the amount indoors, limiting the amount of light that a plant can get in terms of wattage, outdoors canopy size. But even canopy size isn't really that scientific. For this reason, you could be growing in a cloudy area, for instance, San Francisco, or Seattle, which are often overcast, or you could be growing in a really sunny area that has intense light, and you get different results from that. So it isn't fair to just look at the canopy, but also the size of but also the environmental conditions. That would be kind of hard. I think that really what another solution to it would be that that small holders would be also allowed to sell. Perhaps they purchase a license and then they'd be able to sell small amounts.
As like a craft farmer having a set amount of cultivation space, and then you can sort of vertically integrate the whole process.
That's right. or imagine and there've been in California, there've been farmers markets where different cannabis farmers get together, and it's sort of like a farmers market, and I think that would be a good way to resolve some of it. But I think that what the state of California is doing right now, where it has very high taxes and it limits the number of facilities, I think that's wrong. I think that Oklahoma has a better system, and that is you apply for a license, and as long as you're in a legally zoned area, you can open up. And it shouldn't be something, I like you, I don't like you. That's no way to run a system.
Well, and we see in those states that give out limited licenses at the beginning, usually the ones that they do give out after that go to the same people who have those first sets of licenses.
Well, the whole system is corrupt because it's based on how much money you have. In some states, for instance, Nevada, which has very high licensing fees, and then in other areas, they limit the number of facilities. So I like you because you're my friend and you contribute to my campaign, and I don't like you because you're my opponent's brother-in-law.
I believe True Leave they just got hit with a corruption charge in Florida, wasn't it, over their licensing process?
It's inevitable, considering the licensing process itself is corrupt. So everybody associated with it has to get corrupt in order to get a license. And you have the same thing in New York, where they're trying to limit the number of licenses. Is one license for every million people enough? I don't know. That's I don't think that. I think that it should be more something that the market decides.
Well, and I think there's also something to be said that licenses below a certain size should be unlimited to a certain degree. Anyone should have access to a small business of a certain scale.
Well, why shouldn't they have access to a larger business?
Well, I just mean in terms of like, if you don't have $10 million, you can
Yeah.
start out trying as a small business and work your way up.
Right. Well, actually, what's happening is, as the price of cannabis goes down, because the reason why cannabis had a high price is because there was a limited supply that was created by having it illegal, so that many people who might have been great growers just say, as long as it's illegal, I'm not going to be involved in it. So now that it's legal and the supply is going up because it's legal, it's becoming more like a commodity. Any other legal commodity, the price rises and falls on demand, supply and demand, and the supply in the last few years has increased far more than it had before. So that even though demand's going up, supply is outpacing demand, and so the price is falling, and that makes it hard for taxable businesses to compete against the traditional market. Because,
absolutely.
A price of a pound, some pounds are going for $500 to $1,000, and yet prices in the shops might still be $300 to $500 an ounce. So as long as you have that kind of discrepancy in the market, there'll be an arbitrage of sorts. And
especially with the tax rates at what they are. I know there's been a lot of conversation about that this fall, things being in the 30 to 40% range, so that by the time it gets to the consumer, it's artificially inflated by a significant margin already.
Well, that, and then you have the cost of doing business at a dealer or a grower doesn't have that is maintaining a place, all of the licensing things, the
Mm-hmm.
testing, things like that. So it makes it it's, difficult for dispensaries and shops to compete with that, and especially if you're more of a chronic user, you have more of an incentive to find a lower price than the occasional user. So,
Mm-hmm.
or the person who doesn't use a lot. So, a lot of the larger sales are siphoned off by the traditional market.
And it sort of gives a point too towards we should be giving out more licenses. If you let more people in the traditional market in, things might run a little bit better too, and you might see the quality go up.
I don't see where consumers necessarily have a loyalty to dispensaries. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's just another commercial store. I mean, no matter how dedicated the owner might be, ultimately, it's just it's no different than a bakery or a shoe store or any other store, in
Mm-hmm.
that it's a commercial business. And so that if the consumer has a chance to get it at a lower price, I don't see where they have an incentive to stay loyal to the shop.
Well, I think that goes into where you start to talk about cannabis as a luxury good, right? Because there'll always be a market too for a higher quality product, and people probably willing to pay that price as well, right?
I don't think it's based on that. I think that what it's really based on is the cost of doing business and the taxes and things like that. And so, very often, the the independent grower dealer might have quality material that's of equal or superior quality to the material that's going into the shop.
Mm.
So that's what I meant with, by the that the consumer does not necessarily have loyalty to the shops.
Mm.
It's not like I
They
love
have
this shop.
loyalty to the farm more than they do to the place they're buying it at.
I think they have loyalty to the product
Mm.
rather than to where they're getting it.
Do you think that that goes into strains as well if they can find consistent, sorry, if they happen to find that if, say for example, OG Kush, I
Yeah.
know you can get different variations of it, but I know a lot of people look for that particular strain. Do you think that there's loyalty to strain at all or particular cultivar?
Loyalty to strain is often in it competes with price. So you might like one strain a really lot, but
Mm-hmm.
if the price of another strain is significantly lower than that, you might make a switch.
Mm-hmm. There was something you mentioned at the Emerald Cup that I was kind of curious about that you were talking about a little bit with light cycles and about
Yes.
trying to grow a little more in tune with light cycles. I was curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, you know that um, most marijuana, excluding autoflowers, flower starts to flower, initiates flowering based on the number of hours of uninterrupted darkness it receives.
Mm.
So in the fall, as the number of hours of darkness increases, that's a, that's a signal to the plant to start flowering. That quality of the plant can be used in a number of ways
Mm-hmm.
to induce flowering or stop flowering. To stop flowering, you would provide additional uh, hours of light, and you don't actually have to provide a solid block, but you could just interrupt the dark cycle
Mm-hmm.
and by interrupting the dark cycle, the plant doesn't get a long enough uninterrupted dark period to induce flowering. Or if you wanted plants to flower, you could do light deprivation, that is, cover them so that they have a longer dark period than nature is providing it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So using those two things, that is, increasing the light cycle or increasing the dark period or decreasing the dark period, the length of the dark period, what you can do is control when the plant flowers.
Mm-hmm.
And the theory that I go on is that is based on what I call what's called carbon allocation, and that is, the plant gathers carbon from the atmosphere when it absorbs CO2 and breaks the carbon dioxide, and then uses the CO2 and the hydrogen from water to make sugars.
Mm-hmm.
And then so that carbon, so if the plant allocates that carbon for plant growth but not flower production, then that allocation isn't doing the farmer or the consumer any good. So if it's just growing branches and leaves and things like that, because what we're interested in is the bud. So my idea is to manipulate, not only mine, but the idea would be to manipulate the plant to spend most of its time producing flowers rather than growing infrastructure. So you'd have a much simpler plant without much branching or any branching at all, but maybe just a main stem, and then flowers, so that the plant spends a higher percentage of its time actually producing material useful to humans.
And I think also might allow people to harvest a little bit earlier as well and still maintain ripeness, right?
Yes. Well, what happens is that instead of having one plant uh, growing to cover the canopy over a period of time, it grows
Mm-hmm.
a branch, and then it grows more branches, and it grows out and continues growing until the canopy is filled. What if you put in more a larger number of plants into the canopy, and then each plant would only have to grow a little for the canopy to be filled.
Mm-hmm.
So all that time that was spent in developing a plant to fill the canopy, all that time is largely eliminated, so that there's a faster turnover of plants, more
And
harvest in a time period.
yeah, keep making things as efficient as possible on the
Yes.
farm, trying to make sure it's sustainable and you can operate at pace sort of to compete. I'm curious, do you think large scale indoor cultivation, and I don't mean mixed light, because I think that there's a place for mixed light greenhouses, but I mean indoor cultivation sort of in the more sterile environment, do you think that's sustainable long term?
It depends. That first of all, there are two things with that. The first thing is that the cost of setup and maintenance can become a factor in this, especially as the price of cannabis goes down.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a fixed price for production and the price is going down, then your margins are going down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's been going on. I mean, a few years ago, or let's say maybe 10 years ago, cannabis was going for $3,000 a pound or so. And it's gone down to a third of that. So all of that profit that farmers were making, you know, has been eliminated, and that's continuing to happen. So that, you know, it's going to be priced more like ordinary commodities than this precious commodity with a lack of supply.
And I think that also might mean that you'll see the transition over of the larger operators to larger scale outdoor operations as well.
Well, it will be more and more difficult for farms that have high operating costs. Either, you know, it might not be the cost of production; it might just be the rent. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, if you're growing in San Francisco, right, then, you know, rent is a major consideration, and so it would be hard to compete with something in Stockton, for instance, where the rents are much lower.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a question of whether a greenhouse can actually compete with, not a greenhouse, but an indoor system can actually compete with an outdoor or a greenhouse system. And
Mm-hmm.
that that's questionable at some point.
Do you think that in terms of like the ecological results, do you think that there at least should be a push towards the mixed light greenhouses instead of the indoor?
Well, I don't see it happening ideologically. I see it just happening as a factor of production costs.
Do you think
Certainly, if you
that
can get free light that you can manipulate, um, it's cheaper than buying electricity.
in terms of like growing outdoor, exclusively outdoor, not in a greenhouse, do you think that there's any sort of superior quality about full term outdoor versus light depth outdoor versus mixed light greenhouse?
Well, there there's some discussion about whether UV what the function of UV light is with plants, and most researchers think that UV light will increase the quality of the amount of THC that the plant produces because of the stress
Mm-hmm.
reaction. So if that's true, then most greenhouse coverings, aside from acrylic, don't allow in UV light. So if that's the case, then a lot of greenhouse structure material would have to be changed. But certainly, mixed light or outdoor cultivation can certainly be cheaper, and especially if you have cheap land. You know, in some southern states, farmland isn't that expensive, and
Mm-hmm.
you could grow 9 months of the year or so outdoors. Depends on the area.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people do have greenhouses that they keep through the winter in a lot of places, a little further up as well, down
Yeah.
in not as far up, I think. I think the further north you go, the less it happens, but even some of the more mountainous areas too, where you might go up a little higher and it might get colder. You know, people overnight or overwinter their plants.
Well, take in Canada, if you take the road from Toronto down to Niagara, that there are millions of square feet of greenhouse that are 12
Mm.
months of the year greenhouses.
Mm-hmm.
I I I do question whether there is profitability in January, late December, January, and February, whether those are actually running profitably at that time.
Like whether the growth is enough to justify how much it takes to run the facility.
Yes, especially the heating. And I know that electricity is much cheaper in Canada than in the US, but even so,
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing with uh, uh, very low natural light levels for a very short period of time, and high heating costs. So it might be easier to have them on a sort of skeleton schedule during the, the coldest months, light dimmest, coldest and dimmest months.
Mm. And may I ask you one more question? I didn't want to take up too much of your time.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about some advice for people that might want to try and keep their own genetics alive at home or rely on their own seed production, because a lot of states you're allowed to buy seeds from licensed seed distributors, but as of yet there are no licensed seed distributors selling seeds.
Well, the first thing is that anybody who wants to buy seeds can buy them over the internet, and there's no way for the government to regulate that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that it's legal, but how? What are they going to do? Open every envelope, every first class envelope? They're not.
Mm-hmm.
So there's very little risk in buying seed over the internet. And then, as far as producing, seed, that's easily enough done as well. So, um, and a lot of, you know, actually, for most people, it will be better to function to grow from clones, because they because the germination process slows down production, and when you use a clone, you know exactly what the plant is going to look like, what it's going to taste like, what its characteristics are going to be. With a seed, it's just like children, in human children. Every time you don't know what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
Your kid might be a great musician or a dullard. You know, it's that's a risk of sexual reproduction as compared with asexual, where you're just making a clone of something has a known value.
Now, say someone found a clone that they really, really liked, but they wanted seeds of that clone or they wanted to try and work with it. What would advice would you give for them?
Well, they could try feminizing the plant so that it produces male flowers, but it's usually not good to fertilize a plant times itself or pollinate a plant times itself.
Mm-hmm.
So at first you'd cross it with another variety, and then you could back cross it over a period of time, so you get a higher percentage of your of your goal plant. So let's say you crossed it with something else. The first time it's 50% of the plant that you like, and
Mm-hmm.
then if you cross that times the plant, then it's 75%. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and then the next resulting, it would be 87%. So in a few generations, it would be that using back crossing, you'd have a plant that's heterosexual, that is mostly comes from that from the genetics that you're interested in.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me, sir. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on, and you can find. Also, I should say
Oh,
I
would you
have
like to
that.
promote your book? I'm so
Yeah,
sorry. I
yeah.
didn't mention that. The Marijuana Grower's Handbook. Yeah, you just
No,
came out with that edition.
actually, it's a Cannabis Growers Handbook, and
Cannabis Grower's Handbook. I
yeah,
apologize.
and it's the latest in the series. And this book, I did it in collaboration with Dr. Rob Flannery, who has a PhD in plant biology, and
Hmm.
we collaborated with a lot of marijuana growers and PhDs, scientists, researchers. We did experiments of our own, and this is the most accurate book. It's also, we designed the book so that anybody can understand it and read it and understand it, and it will make you a better gardener.
I remember Sunshine has a little section in there, and they were giving away some signed copies at K-Mud.
Yes, yes.
I
So,
apologize. I almost let you go before talking about that. Do you have any other projects you want to talk about?
no, that's what I'm working on now. I'm I'm working on a couple another book project, but I don't really want to talk about it at this point. But I do think that people who are interested in growing cannabis would do well to use the Cannabis Growers Handbook. It will help them out a lot, give them a lot of understanding about the plant, and make them successful gardeners.
Yes, sir. And we'll tell them to keep their eyes out for something in the future, maybe.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, sir. Have a happy holidays.
You too.
If you'd like to follow us on any sort of social media for when we post additional content or episodes, we're on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. If you'd like to help this podcast, consider leaving a review in iTunes or coming up Spotify. Helps get the word out and helps other people find us too. Thank you for listening to the Bluegrass Podcast. We're glad you stopped by. Here at the Bluegrass Podcast, we're putting the grass back in the bluegrass.